Welcome back. In this next section, we're going to explore two more indicators for the macroeconomy, unemployment and inflation. So we're going to begin this chapter by measuring the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, and the employment to population ratio. These are all different measures of the health of the labor market. After this, we'll explore the different types of unemployment. These result from different causes and different problems going on in the economy. And finally, we'll explain unemployment. After that, we'll move on to inflation. So first we'll be measuring inflation, what actually goes in, and how we calculate the inflation rate. Next, we'll talk about using price indexes to adjust for the effects of inflation. So that way we can really see what's going on for measures like GDP, for instance. We'll move on to nominal interest rates versus real interest rates, so we'll see what the difference between those two concepts are. And finally, we'll look at how inflation imposes costs on the economy. So last chapter, we learned how to measure total output in an economy, GDP. This is a critical first step in trying to understand the economy and how healthy an economy is, and to track changes over time, or to compare across different countries. Now in this chapter, we're going to continue along these lines, looking at the overall health of economies, and trying to find different ways to measure that. So we'll look at, in this chapter, unemployment and inflation. These are very important, and they're commonly used macroeconomic concepts, but we want to solidify what they mean so you know exactly what's going on, and then we can talk more intelligently about them. So let's begin with section 9.1, measuring the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, and the employment population ratio. And in this chapter, we're going to define all these so you can understand how they're computed and what exactly they mean and what goes into them. There are more than 300 million people in the United States, and monitoring and reporting on their activities regularly would be very difficult and costly. The amount of time and effort that would go into that would be so prohibitive that we wouldn't even be able to gather useful statistics. So instead of that, the U.S. Department of Labor reports estimates of employment, unemployment, and other statistics involved with the labor market. So the labor force is the sum of employed and unemployed workers in the economy. Of these statistics, the most watched, the one you'll hear the most about, is the unemployment rate, or the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. And later on, we'll touch on how there's different levels of unemployment rate that takes into factor different people. In order to estimate the unemployment rate, each month the United States Bureau of the Census conducts the Current Population Survey. It's also called the Household Survey, or the CPS. So they interview adults in a sample of about 60,000 households, and those are chosen to represent the U.S. population. So the household members that are considered are those of working age, or those older than 16 years old. And in the survey, they're asked about employment during the reference week. So they'll ask about a certain week before the survey goes out to understand what was going on in their work life. They're also asked about recent job search activities, whether they're employed currently or whether they don't currently have employment. So the people in the survey are then classified as employed. They're classified as employed if they worked during the week before the survey, or if they were temporarily away from their jobs because they were ill, on vacation, on strike, or for other reasons, but they're actively under contract and have been and will continue to be working. They can also be considered unemployed, and that is if they do not work in the previous week, but they were available for work and had actively looked for work at some time during the previous 4 weeks. So the labor force is the sum of the employed and unemployed workers. The unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed at a current time. Now that doesn't include everyone. There's more people in the economy than just those that are counted as employed or unemployed. So there's several other people that we consider not in the labor force. There's several other types of people. There's retirees, there's full-time homemakers, full-time students, patients in hospital, and those on active military service or in prison. We also don't consider people who are available for work and who have actively worked for a job at some point during the previous year, but have not looked for employment during the previous 4 weeks. And finally, there are people who are available for work, but have not actively looked for a job during the previous 4 weeks because they believe jobs are no longer available. So we call these discouraged workers. Now, the reason the unemployment rate only counts those employed or unemployed and currently looking for jobs is because of what we're trying to learn from the unemployment rate. And we're trying to tell us how loose or tight the labor market is, how easy it is for people to find jobs if they want them, or how difficult it is for people to find jobs if they want them. So when policymakers look at this rate, Having people in there that aren't trying to find a job doesn't really help them understand what they're looking for. So because of that, we only count those that are looking for jobs or currently have jobs. In this slide, we have figure 9.1, which breaks down the entire working age population into different categories that we can classify workers as. So we have first the entire working age population, so everyone above 16 years old. We can then split them into the labor force and those not in the labor force. Now, those in the labor force can be split into the employed workers and unemployed workers. For those not in the labor force, we can split those into not available for work, so that first group of homemakers, students, retirees, people like that. We can also split into available for work but not currently working. So those could be discouraged workers that believe they can't find a job, so they've given up on looking. And those not currently looking for work because of things like childcare responsibilities, transportation problems, those sorts of difficulties. So based on the CPS estimates that we get from the survey, we can calculate several important macroeconomic indicators. Now, the most watched is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the number of the unemployed divided by the labor force multiplied by 100 to give us the percentage. So in August 2015, the number of unemployed workers in the economy were 8.03 million. The size of the labor force was 157.07 million. So when you divide 8.03 by 157.07 and multiply that by 100, we end up with 5.1%. The most common measure of the unemployment rate is known formally as the BLS series U3. So there are 6 levels of unemployment from U1 to U3, each one considering more and more people as unemployed. The definition I've given you so far, the number of unemployed divided by the labor force, is the definition of the U3, and that's the only one we're going to work with in this class. Another important labor market indicator is the labor force participation rate. And that's the percentage of the working age population that are considered in the labor force. So we take the labor force, the number of people in labor, and then we divide by the entire working age population. And again, we multiply it by 100 so we can get the percentage. So again, in August 2015, there was 157.07 million considered in the labor force. And there were 251.10 million in the entire working age population. So when we divide 157 million by 251 million, multiply by 100, we end up with 62.6%. So 62.6% of the working age population was considered in the labor force. So they were either employed or they were actively looking for a job. Another important factor is the employment to population ratio. So it's the percentage of the working age population that is employed. So we divide employment by the working age population and multiply that by 100. So employment in August 2015 was 149.04 million, and the entire working age population was 251.10 million. So when we divide 149 million by 251 million, we get 59.3%. So 59.3% of the entire working age population was employed and working during the month of August 2015. Now, the unemployment rate, as measured by the BLS, is not a perfect measure of joblessness. There are some problems with it, and a lot of policymakers have to take into account more than just the unemployment rate when they're looking at the health of the labor market. So, for instance, former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen used to refer to her labor market dashboard, where she had about 12 indicators that she would look at to try to understand the current state of the labor market. So it's a lot more difficult to measure than something like gross domestic product, measuring the total output for an economy. And then there are some accuracy issues. So the unemployment rate from the BLS may understate unemployment. Distinguishing between people who are unemployed and not in the labor force requires some judgment. So should we exclude discouraged workers or not? And that's why we have the different levels of unemployment from U1 to U6. And the unemployment rate only measures employment, not intensity of employment. So you don't get, in the current unemployment rate that we've been looking at, full-time versus part-time breakdown, people who are working fewer hours than they want to work, people that are working a lower-paying job than they want to be working, or something, like a job outside their field. By the same token, the unemployment rate may overstate unemployment. So people can falsely claim to be actively looking for work. Um, it's a survey, so you can't guarantee 100% truthfulness. Um, People may claim to not be working to evade taxes or to keep their criminal activity unnoticed. So people working in the black market aren't going to be considered as employed by the BLS unemployment rate, even though they are working and providing value to someone, just not legally. So some people suggest that we should also include discouraged workers and underemployed workers in the official unemployment statistics. Because while the unemployment rate, U3, the previous measure that we've calculated, shows how difficult it is, how many people want to get jobs but are unable to. That's not the only way to not to reach your goal in the labor market. There's other ways that things could be less than optimal that policymakers should take into account. So the broadest measure we have for unemployment rate, the U6, includes underemployed workers, so workers that are working part-time but want to be working full-time hours, and discouraged workers who haven't been looking for a job in the previous 4 weeks, but they have in the past year, where they've given up because it's too difficult for them to find a job. And we have the official unemployment rate in the red, that's the U3, and then we have this broader measure of unemployment rate, the U6, plotted above. So we can see from 1996 to 2015, the broadest measure of unemployment rate, the U6, was above the official unemployment rate the whole time. And that's because it counts many more workers as unemployed rather than outside of the labor force. Labor force participation rate is important because it determines the amount of labor that's going to be available in the economy from a given population. So the higher the labor force participation rate, the more labor that will be available, and the higher the country's level of GDP and GDP per person. So here we have the labor force participation rate since 1948, and it's broken down by gender, so we have men and women. Labor force participation rate for adult men has declined from almost 90% in 1950, to about 70%, a little under 70% by 2014. But we've seen labor force participation rate for women increase pretty substantially from about 30% up to almost 60%. Although recently we've seen the labor force participation rate for women decline a little bit as well. While the unemployment rate returned to a normal level after the 2007-2009 recession, people have noted there still seems to be weakness in the labor market. Look at the unemployment rate alone, you wouldn't be able to see that. But when we take into account other measures, we see there's still considerable slack in the labor market. So the employment population ratio, another one of our labor market indicators, has shown there's still the labor market still has not returned. We haven't seen a full healthy economy since the recession. So the total population, the employment population ratio for the total population was about 63% throughout the 90s and 2000s. But during the recession, it fell down to like the mid to upper 50s. And even today, despite the recovery, or let's say to 2016, despite the recovery, it was still below the recession level. And being below the recession level, it was about as if 8 million people who would have been working in the labor force were not in 2015, 2016. So the 8 million additional workers, that's a lot of GDP we're missing out on. And that's a lot of people that had been working in the past, but now are not working because they've been discouraged. They weren't able to find jobs, so they just left the labor market. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this could be happening, and some are good and some are less good. So first is labor market scarring. Because of the slow recovery from 07 to 09, it meant some people were out of work for a long time. When you're out of work for a long time, your skills deteriorate, and it's harder to find a job, harder to break back in once you've been out for too long. Another is an increased number of people receiving Social Security disability insurance. So some people that otherwise might be working are receiving payments because from the Social Security disability insurance more than were in the past. So Alan Kruger from Princeton University indicates that about half of prime-age men who aren't in the labor force are receiving SSDI. The next is the Affordable Care Act. So some economists at the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Affordable Care Act, which gave people subsidies in order to buy health insurance if they didn't have it, has led to some people not working because they've now been able to get health insurance, whereas they wouldn't have been able to afford to without a full-time job in the past. Next is the minimum wage. So because minimum wage laws artificially increase the wages that firms have to pay employees, some low-skilled workers aren't going to be hired at those wages. So that's going to keep people out of the labor force. So that's going to lead to some of the workers leaving the labor force. And the final one is better video games. Now this sounds like a joke, but really the opportunities for leisure and the quality of leisure has increased substantially over the past 20 to 30 years. So we see a lot of people are able to occupy their times doing a lot more entertaining things than they were in the past. So we now have this other thing pulling people away. So if you're not particularly skilled in a specific industry, if you're not someone who's not highly educated or wouldn't be making very high wages, what you have to give up, so these wages actually going out and working, is much lower compared to others, and the joy you can get, the fun you can have with these luxuries, is much higher than in the past. So for some people, they consider it not worth it to work. So in addition to surveying households, the Bureau of Labor Statistics also uses an establishment survey, which is also called the payroll survey, to help to measure total employment in the economy. So what they do is every month they survey a sample of about 3,000 business establishments. So these can be things like factories, stores, offices, all different types of employers. Now this survey does have some drawbacks. First is it doesn't provide information on the number of self-employed persons, because they're technically not on a company payroll. So you miss out on some of these opportunities for employment. The survey may fail to count some persons employed at newly operated firms. So often newly operated firms aren't included in the survey, because they're new, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't know about them yet. The survey provides no information on unemployment. While it tells you how many people are hired and how many people are working, so it does give you some idea of how well the labor market's doing, it doesn't show you workers that are unemployed. So you don't know how many are looking for jobs but unable to find them. And finally, the values for employment that the BLS initially announces can be significantly revised, so once data from other establishments become available. And we often see this not just with the establishment survey, but with a lot of macroeconomic indicators, including GDP and unemployment, and inflation as well. You'll see later on, the next quarter or two, they'll be revising the current data to make it more accurate. But a big advantage of using the establishment survey, and why a lot of economists tend to use the establishment survey when they're trying to gauge the health of the labor market, is the data is determined by real payrolls. So there's actual proof and evidence that these people are working, not a self-reported household survey. Self-reported survey, people can lie, people can fudge. There's less verification than there is actually surveying the places where these people work. So on this slide, we have the household and the establishment survey data for July and August 2015. So first thing you'll notice if you look at the number employed, that the household survey has a higher number than the establishment survey. So for July, there's 148 million employed in the household survey, and for the establishment survey in July, there's 142 million. Now the reason that the number of employed is higher is that the household survey is counting self-employed, and they're counting people that are employed in small businesses that have not been included in the survey yet. Additionally, there may be some people lying that they're employed when they're actually unemployed. You'll also notice that the establishment survey, another one of the drawbacks, is that they don't have figures for unemployed, the labor force, or the unemployment rate. So because of this, they'll often report the number of, let's say, jobs that are added, so what the increase in the number of employed from one month to the other, they'll use the establishment survey. And then for the unemployment rate, for the labor force, for the number of unemployed, they'll quote the household survey. So both economists and government policymakers rely on this economic data that the government gathers, like the unemployment rate and the establishment survey, to help understand the current state of the economy and to figure out what needs to be done. So in order to avoid long waits in supplying data to policymakers, And for the general public, so economists that are like doing research, more like myself, the government agencies usually issue some sort of preliminary estimates. And then as time goes on, they're able to further tabulate the information. They come out with revisions to that data over time. So the figure on this slide shows the revisions to the employment changes as reported from the Establishment Survey. And it's over 2007 to 2010. You can see, the green bars are revisions in a positive way to show that they underestimated the number of workers in the economy. The red bars are overestimations of the number of employees in the economy. So the unemployment rate, the employment situation was worse than the initial estimates. So we could see that there were large revisions that the BLS was making from 2007 through early 2009. During the height of the recession, they were severely underestimating how bad it was. So policymakers at the time were working with faulty data, showing a situation where things are actually better than they really were. So this is some of the pitfalls of trying to use this economic data, especially in the very short term, because there's accuracy problems as they're trying to get the data out and using just a small portion of all the information they're gathering to try to make these larger conclusions and to make these estimates so the policymakers have something to work with. While it's better than going completely blind, it still can be misleading. As we see from the Great Recession, it can cause policymakers to underestimate how bad things really are. So in the economy, there is constantly job creation and job destruction. There are new firms that are forming, that are hiring new workers, or old firms that are expanding, that are creating new positions within this existing firm. And on the other hand, there's always firms going out of business or eliminating different lines of their business. So they're deleting jobs in this case. This is called labor market churn, and the whole process is called creative destruction. Whereas some jobs are created by new ideas, by new industries, and other jobs are destroyed by those advancements. So because of this, we see the actual jobs in the economy constantly changing, even if the overall number of jobs is staying roughly the same. So back in 2014, there were about 29.1 million new jobs created that year, new positions that were being filled within old firms or new firms being created entirely. At the same time, about 26.1 million jobs were destroyed. So these are positions within firms that are being removed, or firms that are going out of business. And this is a natural process for the economy, especially in a market economy where we allow new firms and new ideas to take place and to destroy the old. This is going to happen. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they report the net changes in the number of people employed and unemployed. But these numbers don't fully account for how dynamic the U.S. job market really is. It doesn't show how many people are leaving old jobs and going into new jobs. Now let's move on to section 9.2, where we'll look at the different types of unemployment. So we're going to focus on 3 different types of unemployment that make up the total unemployment rate. The first is frictional unemployment. So this is short-term unemployment that arises from the process of matching workers with jobs. Because there's always going to be workers looking for jobs in the process of finding new jobs, there's always going to be some frictional unemployment that just takes place because of the amount of time it takes to find a new job. Next is structural unemployment. This is unemployment that arises from a persistent mismatch between the skills and attributes of workers and the requirements of jobs. So maybe there's jobs out there that have requirements, that they need skills that there's not a lot of potential employees that have. Or maybe there's employees that have skills in a particular industry that's not very much needed anymore. So now they're finding difficulty finding jobs outside of that. And finally, there's cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that's caused by a business cycle recession. Now, over the next several slides, we're going to look at each of these in turn. So on this slide, here's a figure showing the annual unemployment rate in the U.S., going from 1950 to 2014. As we can see, it's constantly rising and falling over time. So when the unemployment rate is rising, the economy is doing poorly. And when the unemployment rate is falling, the economy is doing quite well. But you'll notice they never fall to 0. In fact, the unemployment rate doesn't get much below 3 at any point on this unemployment chart. So the types of unemployment can help us understand why there's always going to be some unemployment in the economy. First, we'll look at frictional unemployment. Fractional unemployment is short-term unemployment that arises from the process of matching workers with jobs. So workers have different skills, interests, and abilities, and the jobs out there, they have different skill requirements, working conditions, and pay levels. So as a result, a new worker entering the labor force or a worker who has lost their job and looking for a new one will probably not find an acceptable job right away. It's going to take time to undergo the job search to match to a decent job that fits your skills and your wants, and to find a company that's going to want you. Now, this fractional unemployment also occurs because of seasonal unemployment. So some jobs fluctuate in the ability due to seasonal demand. So examples are like ski instructor, farm work, retail employment around Christmas time. Different times of year, there's going to be different levels of demands for these workers. So in order to account for this seasonality of demand in certain industries, the BLS releases raw data, so the actual numbers, and then they release what's called seasonally adjusted employment figures, which accounts for the changes across the season. Economists and policymakers tend to rely on seasonally adjusted data as a more accurate measure of the current state of the labor market, because we don't want to take into account seasonal fluctuations that we know are going to happen every year. We want to know the underlying unemployment rate. So we want to know the trends that are going on besides something that's typically going to happen every single year, that really policymakers can't affect or can't change the sort of seasonal nature of some industries. Next, we'll look at structural unemployment. So structural unemployment is unemployment that arises from a persistent mismatch between the skills and attributes of workers and the requirements of some jobs. So for instance, computer-generated 3D animation has replaced the traditional, old-school, hand-drawn, two-dimensional animation in a lot of films and television shows. So you remember cartoons like Wacky Racers from the old days, which I used to love watching when I stayed home sick from school. They used a lot of hand-drawn animation, whereas now we're seeing far more computer 3D animation in kids' cartoons. So in order for these workers to become employed again, they have to either become skilled in computer generating animation, or they need to find a whole new occupation. And in this meantime, while they're either trying to build these new skills or finding a new job where they can use their old skills, they're going to be unemployed. So economists call people in these situations structurally unemployed. So again, that's this persistent mismatch between job skills and attributes. So frictional unemployment tends to be short-term because it's people looking for jobs trying to find that match for jobs that actually meets their skills. Structural unemployment can last for a much longer period of time because workers need to learn new skills. So for another example, employment in the US by steel firms fell by more than half between the early 80s and the early 2000s. So the increased unemployment for the steel industry workers increased because of more competition from foreign producers and some technological change that substituted machines in place of workers. So a lot of steel workers found themselves in new jobs in other industries only after a long period of time where they had to retrain and build these new skills. And finally, let's look at cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that's caused by a business cycle recession. So when the economy moves into a recession, so when our total output begins to fall, many firms are going to find their sales falling. So what they're going to do is they're going to cut back on production. They're going to try to lower labor costs to make up for that. So as production falls and as they try to reduce their labor costs, they're going to lay off workers. So workers who lose their jobs because of recession are experiencing cyclical unemployment. It's not due to any skills mismatch or the frictions of the process of trying to find a new job. It's because of what's going on with the macroeconomy. So for instance, during the recession in 2007, 2008, Ford Motor Company laid off a lot of workers because there was a reduced demand for their automobiles. So they needed to reduce their employment costs. As the economy recovered from the recession, as we moved on through the 2010s, Ford began hiring more and more workers, bringing them back or hiring back new workers. So we saw the cyclical unemployment rate increase during the recession, and then during the recovery, it decreases again as firms are selling more and more, so they're increasing their revenue and they're willing to increase their output. So when all unemployment is due to frictional or structural factors, we say that the economy is in full employment. This means that there is always some unemployment that's going to be present in the economy just because of the skills mismatches that are always going to exist, or the time it takes between losing a job and finding a new job. So economists refer to this employment that's always present, some structural, some frictional, as the natural rate of unemployment. So the general consensus for economists is that the U.S. natural rate of unemployment is somewhere between 5% and 5.5%. Now this is a general consensus. Some economists have estimated it lower, as closer to about 3 to 3.5%, which is where we were at before the coronavirus and all the lockdowns caused the economy to enter a recession. Now let's move on to explaining unemployment. In this section, we're going to look at the factors that determine the levels of frictional and structural unemployment. In later chapters, we're going to come back to this idea of unemployment, and we'll explore the causes of the business cycle, which will help us understand cyclical unemployment. So right now, we'll just try to explain the first two types of unemployment. So first is government policies and the unemployment rate. Governments often attempt to directly influence unemployment. So for example, the federal government's Trade Adjustment Assistance Program offers training to workers whose firms laid them off as a result of competition from foreign firms. So this helps to reduce structural unemployment because you're now training workers to enter new fields. So you're reducing the amount of time they're going to have to spend unemployed until they can enter a new profession or a new field. Other policies try to reduce frictional unemployment. So for example, they can help subsidize new hires for firms. Although, some other government policies increase the unemployment rate. So for instance, unemployment insurance and the minimum wage. Unemployment insurance makes it easier for people to spend time unemployed because they're now making money to tide them over in the short term. While this is good that it helps people and people aren't going to be struggling while they're unemployed and looking for a new job, and while it will help them be willing to take more time until they find a job that truly meets their skill level and their need, it's also going to increase the unemployment rate in the short term because these workers, former workers who are out there still looking for jobs, are not going to have, they'll end up spending a longer time unemployed when they have unemployment insurance. Another thing, minimum wage laws help increase the unemployment rate. Because they make it more expensive to hire workers, firms are going to hire a fewer number of workers. So government can both do specific things targeted to decrease the unemployment rate, and they do things specifically that end up increasing the unemployment rate. Another thing that helps increase the unemployment rate is labor unions. So labor unions are organizations of workers that bargain with employers for higher wages and for better working conditions. They try to support workers and make their work life easier. Now, because they increase employees' wages, employees end up being paid more than the equilibrium market wage. So what that means is employers in unionized industries end up hiring fewer workers because they have these higher labor costs per worker. Now, unions probably aren't a significant cause of unemployment in the U.S. It's probably just a much smaller effect on the overall unemployment rate, because while they do raise employees' wages, so decreasing the employment within those industries, only about 6.5% of workers in the private sector are unionized. So that really limits the effects that unions can have on the wider economy. If unions were a much larger portion of the U.S. economy, then they would have a larger effect on employment. Finally, let's look at efficiency wages. An efficiency wage is an above-market wage that a firm pays to increase workers' productivities. So obviously, firms want to get the best performance they can out of their workers. They want them to be as productive as possible. And it's much cheaper to have one employee work harder than it is to pay them to work harder than it is to hire a whole new employee. Sometimes monitoring workers is difficult or very costly to make sure they're doing their job, they're not slacking off. So one alternative that they do in some firms or in some industries is to pay workers a relatively high wage, higher than than they would get on the market, help motivate them to perform well in order to keep that job. Because they know if they lose that job, they get caught slacking off, they get fired, they go somewhere else, even if it's the same job or in the same industry, they'll end up making less money. So because of that, they're more motivated to work hard. So these above market wages, again, end up decreasing employment in this firm or in this industry where these efficiency wages are being paid. So all of these things, minimum wage laws, labor unions, efficiency wages, unemployment insurance, these are not done in order to increase the unemployment rate. These are done for other reasons. But they end up, as a side effect, increasing the unemployment rate at least a little bit. So it's just worth it to know that while these may have very good effects, they do have some side effects on employment. And it's another reason why there's always some unemployment that's going to be present in an economy no matter how well it's doing. That brings us to the close of the unemployment rate. Now we're going to move on to looking at inflation to understand the price level and to see what changes in the price level actually mean for consumers. So in the previous chapter, when we were talking about gross domestic product, we mentioned the idea of the price level, so some sort of measure of the average prices of goods and services in an economy. Now, when we refer to the inflation rate, that's the percentage change in the price level from one year to the next. Typically, the inflation rate is going to increase, and that's what we've seen in the United States pretty much exclusively since the Great Depression. But there can also be decreases in the price level moving from one year to the next. Last chapter, we used the GDP deflator to measure the changes in the price level.